I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight on behalf of Platypus, the group that organized this event. Platypus started in 2006 at the University of Chicago and the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's a group that's dedicated to studying the history of the left, the old left, the new left, and the post-political left. Platypus also puts on reading groups. We have a current reading group in New York right now that meets on Sundays. If you'd like to find out more about that, you can see me or anybody else that's wearing this pin. Chris, Brian, the two people that you saw out in the hall. Brett over here, I don't know if he's wearing a pin, but you can talk to him about it. Platypus also does film screenings, and we also have coffee breaks, which are informal get-togethers where people come and talk about politics. We have 2 coffee breaks currently in New York City. One is at the Lang Cafe at the New School, and the other one is at Think on Mercer. And the one on Mercer is from 6 until 7 on Tuesdays. Also, you can check out our website, platypus1917.org, and then click on New York to find out all the information about New York. We also have an upcoming roundtable that's going to be a student discussion on race after the election of Obama. And we're kind of still putting that together. We have some student speakers that are interested, but if anybody knows of anyone, they don't have to be an academic. We're actually trying to make this more of a student-focused event, someone that wants to get involved in a discussion about race politics, critical race politics. Please see one of us after the event. Also, if you're just interested in putting on these types of events, we just had an event about architecture. If you enjoyed this event today, or if you're just simply intrigued by the Platypus Review or our slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left." Once again, see any of us to get involved or get more information.
Thanks everyone for coming, especially with the sudden room changes and everything. So what I'll do is I'll just introduce the panel description and panelists, and then we'll begin the conversation. All of you have pamphlets in front of you that list the description as well as the questions that we asked all 4 panelists. So if you, after all their presentations and during the audience Q&A, if you feel like some of them haven't been hit on or you would like to address them further, we welcome you to do so. Before I begin, I just want to thank the New School for hosting this. Erin Orr, who works for the student programs, and she helped me greatly with this, and then the Student Financial Advisory Committee provided funding for this event as well. And of course, I want to thank the panelists and all of you for coming. The structure of the panel will be fairly basic. Each panelist will have about 15 minutes tops to start with their opening remarks, and then each panelist will then be able to respond to each other for 2 to 4 minutes after their initial opening remarks. From there, we'll provide a Q&A session where people can just raise their hands, and I'll pick 1, 2, or 3 at a time, depending on how eager all your questions are. So what I'll do is I'll read the panel description, and then we'll begin. So the death of art has been a recurring theme within aesthetic and philosophical discourse for over 2 centuries. At times, this death has been proclaimed as an accomplished fact. At others, artists themselves have taken the death of art as a goal of being accomplished. So while this widely perceived death is laminated by many as a loss, it is celebrated by others as a moment of life renewed. For them, art is all the better for having disburdened itself with the baggage of outmoded modernist ideologies. Insofar as the death of long-standing cultural traditions has in the past typically been understood to signal a deeper crisis in society at large, however, the meaning of death necessarily takes on a different aspect today, especially when the tradition is in question is modernism, the so-called, quote-unquote, the tradition of the new. Because the very idea of death and crisis appear to belong to the edifice of modernity and has been rejected, these two are to be jettisoned as part of the conventional yoke. Modernity itself has become passé, and even the notion of art's death seemed to have died along with modernism. We thus asked our panelists not merely whether art is at present dead, but also if traditions are even permitted the right to perish in conservative times. If some once held that the persistence of philosophy indicated the persistence of obsolete social conditions, does the persistence of art signal ongoing social conditions that ought to have long ago withered away? If so, what form of politics and artistic practice would be sufficient to realize art? And in what ways would realizing art signal something beyond art? Marx felt that the increasing worldliness of philosophy in his time demanded not only the end of philosophy, but also the world itself become philosophical. If avant-garde movements once declared uncompromising war on art in order to tear down the barrier between art and life, would the end of overcoming of art not simply require the world itself to become artistic? So I'll read the panelist bios. Here we have Anton Vidokle speaking in lieu of Julieta Aranda, who unfortunately couldn't make it. So he'll be reading her remarks, but then during the Q&A, I'm sure he'll add his own interjections when he sees fit. But I think he's going to try to stay true to Julieta's own voice. So Julieta Aranda was born in Mexico City and currently lives and works between Berlin and New York. Central to Aranda's multidimensional practice are her involvement with circulation mechanisms and the idea of the, quote, poetics of circulation, end quote. The possibility of a politicized subjectivity through the perception of use and time, and the notion of power over imagery. Aranda's work has been exhibited internationally at venues such as Genova, ArtPostions, Miami, Basel, Documenta 13, Venice Biennial, The Living as Form and Creative Time in New York, which took place last year, the Istanbul Biennial, the new Museum of Contemporary Art, MOCA Miami, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, second Moscow Biennial, the VII Havanna Biennial, and among many others. As a co-director of e-flux together with Anton Vidokle, Aranda has developed the projects Time Bank, Pawn Shop, and e-flux video rental, all of which started in the e-flux storefront in New York and have traveled to many venues worldwide. Next we have Greg Horowitz, who's a professor of philosophy and chair of social science and cultural studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and the adjunct associate professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He writes on aesthetics and the philosophy of art, psychoanalysis, and political theory. His publications include the book Sustaining Loss, Art and Mournful Life, and The Wake of Art, Philosophy, Criticism, and the End of Taste, which was co-authored with Arthur Danto and Tom Green. Recently, Horowitz published articles such as Absolute Bodies, The Video Puppets of Tony Osler, The Homeopathic Image, or Trauma, Intimacy, and Poetry, and The Late Adventure of the Feeling of Loss, Trauma, and the Limits of Psychoanalysis. Next, we have Paul Maddock, who teaches philosophy at Adelphi University and is the author of a book called Art in Its Time, and a co-author of a book with Katie Siegel called Artworks, Money. He has written criticism for arts, Art in America, Art Form, The Nation, and the Brooklyn Rail, as well as catalog essays for exhibitions at a number of museums and galleries. Finally, we have N.B.K, who is an organizer with Strike That and co-editor of the magazine title, Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy. His work as an art critic has appeared in venues including October, Grey Room, Texter Kunst, Oxford Art Journal, The Nation, and Waging Nonviolence. He recently co-edited a volume for Zone Books entitled Sensible Politics, The Visual Cultures of Non-Governmental Activism. So the order of the opening remarks will start with Anton, then Paul, Yates, and end with Greg. So Anton can begin whenever he's ready.
Okay, so just remember that I'm not Anton, I'm just like a voice transmission from Julieta Aranda, who unfortunately is not here. Julieta speaks usually very, very rapidly. I can't speak as fast. So it may take me a little bit longer to deliver her remarks because we're not operating at the same speed. So, it was with a strange sense of déjà vu that I accepted the invitation to attend yet another funeral for art. Of course, I have heard about all the previous funerals, but this is the first time I am invited to attend one. I wondered, what does one wear to such an event? I realized that this is an occasion that is beyond clothes, so I've decided instead to wear, or occupy, the body of Anton Vidokle. I am here as an artist, and for an artist it's hard to understand the compulsion to establish our sense of art history through the recurrent announcements of the death of art. Art seems to be constantly dying, but we never talk much about its birth. And yet, it must have been stubbornly reborn in countless occasions, since we are here again trying to measure its vital signs. I tried to do a bit of research into the many deaths of art, but I was quickly overwhelmed. In one way or another, we have been trying to put art in a coffin and nail it shut for the past 2,000 years. In the 1980s, during the art market boom, there were plenty of death calls. The death of painting was thoroughly advertised, as was the death of modernism, that's postmodernism. Meanwhile, the New York art market was very much alive, thriving, fueled by the usual suspects, speculators, investors, real estate developers, social climbers, and so forth. Of course, as with everything that is artificially inflated, there was an eventual market crash, and this crash had many casualties. Many galleries disappeared and many artists' careers dried out. But this wasn't understood to be the death of art, as it had been previously announced. Though this happened before my time, I understand that if anything, it was a painful yet welcome submarine respite from the excesses of predatory practices and the market that has gotten out of hand. I'm skeptical about the Peter and the Wolf annunciations of an imminent death for art, this time in its contemporary incarnation. So instead of asking once again if art is either finally dead or dead again, it is more interesting for me to question the too favorable disposition, almost a wish, that we have towards the demise of art. I would venture to say that death sentence towards contemporary art comes not only because the current operative model for contemporary art is deficient under the current model, meaning is often quickly emptied out from objects and images, and market artists are a renewable resource. But this wish also comes partly because we want a new big thing. We want the new thing to come now. We want the now. We want to be the new thing now, while the market is booming. As Hito Starl, a German video artist and writer, points out in her essay, "The New Flesh: Alternatives of Images," the afterlives of images, to declare something over or dead is a form of production that purposefully kills off something in order to launch new commodities or attract attention. After this train of thought, I am confused about what death means. So in order to understand, I will attempt another approach. It would help me to try to see clearly the body of the patient we may be condemning to death. What is it that we call contemporary art? To assume a one-to-one equivalence between contemporary art and the art market for contemporary art, so that we can pass a summary judgment and quickly condemn it to death as an evil that needs to be eradicated, would be like holding a perfunctory trial, the outcome of which we know in advance. What happens in this case to artistic practices that have no market value? And what happens to art that is currently produced in situations where there is no market to speak of? Is this art not contemporary? Is this art also dying? If we choose to talk about art of the past 50 years only in the ways in which it has been coded by capital, we may be simplifying the body we're trying to find and giving it an outline we can reject. Paul Mason's recent article for the BBC refers exclusively to a contemporary art that is full of obscenely rich concept artists, whose work is executed by minions, and subsequently the artists involved in Occupy are pitted against the world described as the white wall gallery, with its air of non-committal, its preference for the meaningless gesture, its reliance on interpretation by the viewer, and its extreme focus on commercialization. The problem is that if we accept the above definition of contemporary art's body, we're again defining this body we're ready to bury as that of a Caucasian white male. And I'm sorry, but in the interest of the art that I care for, I feel compelled to challenge this definition. While the structure of the gallery system is indeed troublesome, to use it as a synonym for all of the contemporary artistic practices outside of the work of the artist affiliated with Occupy would be a gross misrepresentation. More so, it would be one that persists in depicting the West, and specifically New York, as the center of the world. While this is true for New Yorkers, it's not necessarily true for everybody else. We could go ahead and declare that contemporary art as we know it is dead or dying, and replace it with the next new black. Today Occupy, tomorrow something else. But to be so ready to broadly dismiss contemporary art in a summary gesture, replacing it entirely with a new understanding of art that is advocating an obligatory commitment to explicit leftist political ideologies and a sense of social purpose, doesn't actually sound so new to me. Hasn't this conversation been going on continuously since 1920s? In fact, it makes me think of the Chinese Cultural Revolution and Cambodia's Year Zero, or of Plato's position towards poets, quoting from the Republic, This is for Plato. But for our own good, we ourselves should employ a more austere and less pleasure-giving poet and storyteller, one who would imitate the speech of a more decent person, and who would tell his stories in accordance with the patterns we laid down when we first undertook the education of our soldiers. Good intentions aside, isn't this model slightly prescriptive? As far as it goes to meaning in contemporary art, when I see the work of artists like Walid Rad or Jimmy Durham or Katerina Seda, what I see is a successful smuggling into the dominant narrative of history and images that otherwise, let me read this again. What I see is the successful smuggling into dominant narrative of histories and images that otherwise would not be accessible. I do not consider their practices less meaningful just because they enjoy a considerable degree of success, and I certainly appreciate the histories and images that they smuggle, retain all of their original political complexity and their uncomfortable qualities without being flattened or prepackaged into ready-to-eat morsels. Of course, it is extremely problematic to see that there is such a financial apparatus currently rigged around contemporary art. It may be the biggest instance of an art market that has yet ever been in operation. On top of this, the concomitant professionalization of the art system, which aims at feeding this market through a proliferation of expensive art schools and training programs put in place to produce, train, and train domesticable, reliable artists that can produce in turn viable commodities, only adds fuel to the fire. However, it is possible to understand to a certain degree the willingness of certain artists, not all, to enter this problematic situation. You see, it has been tacitly agreed that artists shouldn't concern themselves with money. And while the idea of making a living from art is interpreted as being morally corrupt, there is no alternative system in operation to guarantee the welfare of artists. Artists who sell out are bad, but if they refuse to do that, then what happens to them? How are they supposed to make a living? It has always been unclear to me how artists are supposed to take care of mundane needs such as paying rent, going to the dentist, having dinner, taking a child to the doctor. Here is where we're getting to what for me is the real issue. The current conditions of production of art are in dire shape. There is a shrinkage of unpredictable spaces, an erosion of relationships that are not professional, a disappearance of a bohemian, non-domesticated world. This may be a temporary condition, only applicable while the market lasts, but it is a damaging condition nonetheless, a condition that could render the soul homeless. So as I look at the shape-shifting body of art in its contemporary inception, a body which doesn't seem to fit its coffin or even its own definition, it becomes clear to me that contemporary art may just not be as simple as a single thread constructed that we try to collect into a digestible unit. Art produced today has many paradigms, some of them depleted, others full of potential. Art will transform, as it always has historically, and become something other than contemporary, an art that we don't know yet, and that we will only know when it has arrived. Instead of a coffin with its irreversible solemnity, it may be better to make sure that there are fertile conditions in place for the new art to come. The patient will live. Let's build a better world for her. Or a word for her, sorry. That's it.
Just so we're clear, the image that's actually projected above the panelists was chosen by Julieta for whatever reason. So the next we'll have Paul speak.
Thank you. I'm going to read this, even though I wrote it myself. You also have a more resonant voice than I have. No, it's okay. But it's just because the materials are very complicated, and I wanted to make sure that I said what I have to say within a short piece of time. So that's my excuse for reading. I'm not sure that I understand any of the questions posed to this panel. So I might as well begin with the first one, especially as it seems the most straightforward. A request to comment on Paul Mason's suggestion that Occupy signals the death of contemporary art. Since Occupy's wonderful but short life has been over for some time, while contemporary art is rolling on, with its full panoply of artists, dealers, writers, auctions, museums, and collectors? The obvious answer to this one is no. Mason's own article confirms this, as it focuses on an Occupy activist turning, once the movement has been dispersed, to attempt to market her agitprop efforts as contemporary art. On the other hand, one should beware the obvious answer, and I will take another look at this question at the end. Before proceeding, I think it will be useful to define the chief term under discussion, or at least to give my definition, so that we can know if and when we are talking about the same thing. Art, since it evolved in Europe in the late 18th century, has been the name for a social practice of valuing, and so of collecting, making, attending to, and displaying objects and performances capable, in view of social conventions, of signifying the discernment of those who appreciate them. In a smaller mouthful, art gives body to taste, and so makes it visible. The exercise of the taste for artworks, like all exercise of choice, attests to the chooser's freedom from necessity, or at least to a willingness to disregard it. Necessity and the commercial culture that came into existence with modern society means above all a concern with money, its making and spending. Art developed its enormous importance within capitalism, the first culture in history to be dominated by the use of money, because it provides a social space for demonstrating freedom from commercial necessity. Art, the opposite of wage labor and capitalist entrepreneurship alike, is work done for love, not money. Its collection and enjoyment signify a spiritual set of interests, raising the art lover above the material concerns of everyday life. And it is this which makes artworks so valuable and expensive. Thus, in the 19th century, art allowed the newly ascendant bourgeoisie to claim the mantle of social superiority formerly worn by the landed aristocracy, for whom paintings, architecture, music, dance, and so forth had been not art, but part of the paraphernalia of daily life. In the 20th century, modern art spoke for the claims of bourgeois society to have established values of its own, with, for instance, the motor car sometimes supplanting and sometimes re-embodying the classic race of the Parthenon. The ascendancy of the United States, a self-made country without a feudal past, after World War II, produced a new twist in the modernist version of art. While a turn-of-the-century magnate like J.P. Morgan still looked to Europe for the artworks required to show that America had arrived, post-war art lovers, and indeed the American government itself, found the highest stage of artistic development in the new American art. This bourgeoisie, the American one, lacked the bad conscience of its forebears. Now, the most avant-garde art, originally produced to mark the distance between the artist and the bourgeois, became the official art of business society. At various points in this long trajectory, the idea has arisen, as noted, that art could come to an end. In the early 1800s, famously, when art was just beginning, Hegel believed art would, like religion, cede its cultural significance to philosophy. Alas, I speak from the perspective of a professional philosopher, philosophy has turned out to be of negligible cultural significance compared to art. The radical upheavals following World War I gave rise to various forms of the idea that the revolutionary transformation of daily life might lead to the absorption of art in the form of industrial design into life. Such ideas were encouraged by the habit of looking at art as pursuing an autonomous, unified history, with one school succeeding another school, a history directed, following the Hegelian model, towards the realization of a goal. Such a history can be imagined to reach some sort of end when that goal is attained. The success of advanced art, so-called advanced art in the post-war period, gave rise to the related idea of the death of the avant-garde, an idea with much truth in it. since after around 1960, the avant-garde system, with critics and other cultural intermediaries alerting maverick collectors to the masterpieces of the future, did in fact break down. The critics, for example, almost uniformly hated pop art, but collectors bought it anyway, and soon the critics had to like it. With avant-gardism's demise, the pluralism of the art world gradually became unmistakable, though attempts were made to hold it at bay by defining new avant-gardes, especially by academic writers and art historians like the members of the October Circle. But whatever the success of this attempt in academia, the art world saw the death of the critic as control over taste was exercised by curators, auctioneers, and collectors themselves. This process cannot be fully understood without reference to the development of capitalism itself in the same time period. The crisis of the mid-1970s announced the end of the great post-war economic boom. Henceforth, capitalism's dynamism shifted increasingly away from productive investment towards financial speculation. We all know the results: the globalization of capital on the one hand, and growing inequality in the distribution of wealth on the other, with a new international elite concentrating a hitherto unknown share of the world's wealth in its hands. Art, museum and gallery art at any rate, the situation is rather different for art music, became basically a possession of the global 1%, albeit a luxury good whose value still requires general visibility and appreciation. What might be said above all to have met its death in this state of affairs, as this state of affairs developed, is the role of educated people, what Pierre Bourdieu called the dominated fraction of the dominating class, as the arbiters of cultural value. This is part of a general devaluation of the thing once celebrated as culture, manifested in such phenomena as the decline of liberal arts education and the growing and underemployment of the educated, now condemned by the new terms of accredit-enabled capitalism to lifelong debt peonage. And that has effects directly for artists. I think this was one of the most, a very particularly interesting point in Aranda's piece. Another aspect of this same transformation is the disappearance of the material basis of bohemian life, cheap rents, affordable studios, and so forth. Even the ability to buy a meal for less than $100. Occupy was above all the protest of this social fraction, the devalued educated. As such it was, as a friend observed to me, a symptom of the same condition which has given rise to talk of the death of art, the end of art as a cultural possession of the educated middle class. This means neither that art is over, as the social practice that has been with us for the last 3 centuries, nor that people will stop making things and performances for a wide variety of purposes, both inside and outside the world of art proper. It does mean that the conditions of art making and appreciation have altered in important ways that it would be well worth taking some time to try to understand. And I hope we can take some steps in this direction together tonight. Thanks.
Next we'll have Vince. I'm going to say a couple of Also, I hope my comrades from Portikus won't mind I brought some literature of our own here from Occupy. So this is titled Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy. Well, what else? Okay, so just give me a sec here. I'm going to give more of a conversational thing, and I figured this would be a fairly meta-level discussion based on the questionnaire. There's a lot of kind of negative dialectics going on. So I really just wanted to throw out some images and just flag a couple of important moments in the overall kind of intersection of aesthetic practices and Occupy and its offshoots in the past year and a half. And I actually wanted to begin, since there's this kind of tone of morbidity and death and loss in the air, and I thought that
Julieta spoke nicely to that. I just wanted to read a little thing from the newest issue of Title that hasn't quite, it's just been released, but we don't have hard copies of it. It's called On Love, Loss, and Movement. We came to the park in mourning. We had lost so much. We turned mourning into militancy and felt awakened. We discovered that all was not past, that there was a present in which we might live. We cracked history open, and time seemed full. Everything was happening in the now. Then came the eviction, and we were dispersed. In the aftermath of the park, we mourn what was lost. But know that we can never fully separate from it. We know it is inside us, it haunts us, it speaks to us. We are bound by it, but it does not tie us down to the past. The beloved whispers, you must learn to live now. This means letting go of that perfect future where all the wrongs will be right. That future will always be postponed, not yet open, unavailable, and thus an object of melancholic sadness in advance. We do not wait and we do not lament. The storms of Wall Street are unrelenting. It is what they call progress. There is no shelter, no park where we can ride this out. We have to learn to live in the open. There comes a moment when we know that we can't go on, but we go on. It's easy to break up. To continue with love is hard. Don't be afraid. Don't look back. So that's from Title 4. This has come out. Okay, so I wanted to thank the Platypus folks for the invitation. I thought that the series of questions was really subtle and really speaks to I do think there's a kind of a crisis surrounding the definition of contemporary art and its very sort of identity. Like the Paul Mason idea of the post-contemporary, a little jargony, but I think there's something there. And I'm just going to really speak only for myself about when I address the bigger questions here. Because on the one hand, I'm intrigued by this question of ends and deaths and finalities, but it does seem to me you risk possibly making that into a grand tradition in its own right. The negative dialectic of death, rebirth, I think Witte has spoken to that nicely as well. So on the one hand, you want to avoid any apocalyptic declarations that indeed we have reached the crisis, things are over, something radically new is here. We know that that's naive. We know that happens over and over again in the history of the avant-garde. On the other hand, you just say, well, you know, to try and really describe and account for a break, or even declare a break, you know, I think it should still be possible to do that. And I think that there are moments where history cracks. And I think that in the United States recently, Occupy was certainly that. And I think it has opened up a lot of space to rethink the nature of cultural practice and art and politics, and really see them weaving together in ways that I would say were very much anticipated by some of the most exciting currents in what is known as contemporary art that you would learn at Parsons or at Cooper. But I do think that there's been a moment, a kind of a threshold of freedom, let's say, where some of the taken for granted boundaries and protocols of what contemporary art is had really fallen apart. Now, of course, as people have said, that doesn't mean there is no more art. Of course, there are still schools. People are working and living very precariously, often deeply in debt. So it's not about an apocalyptic end, but I do think something new has happened. And that's something I hope we can all discuss to try and kind of describe what that is. So anyway, I just wanted to show a couple of images here. You may have seen this around the time of the occupations. Of course, the Damien Hirst skull, supplemented with the 1% designation there. I also, before moving on, I wanted to also say that I appreciated the Platypus use of the Rodchenko three primary colors. And of course, this is when Rodchenko declares the end of painting in like 1922, 1921, is that right? He says, there's no more representation. We've reduced everything down to the most bare minimum of colors and perception and the kind of materiality of the object on the wall. And now we're all firmly here in the real world, and now the real art can start. The new true art, which of course for him is going to be a practice of propaganda in collaboration with Berthoff and others. And I think that is also a perennial moment in the history of the avant-garde, and I do feel like we're sort of at a moment like that. So I'll move kind of quickly, just to throw some images, ask a few questions, and then be done with it, and we can talk a bit more. Here is a little dialectic for you. So this is the People's Library at the park. In October of 2011. As you can see there, the librarians helpfully created an arts and culture section. And look what was discovered there, a copy of October magazine, in fact the one devoted to the contemporary, from 2010. And so that was an interesting thing to encounter, and in fact that image eventually made its way into October magazine. And then this on the right hand is what you can find at MoMA right now, in the Architecture and Design Gallery, which is a copy of the Occupied Wall Street Journal that has been that's being displayed on the wall there. You can see it was the one, it was the special poster edition with a lot of really beautiful designs by Josh McPhee. I think Paul Chan had something in there, and a number of other artists. So just to think, this is kind of maybe a dialectic to help ground a later discussion, right? Is what does it mean for a history of the avant-garde to like pop up in a avant-garde political practice, and then vice versa, what does it mean for the very cultural products of that movement to themselves end up back in MoMA, particularly after MoMA had been a real site of struggle for Occupy, surrounding the struggle of the Sotheby's, the locked out Sotheby's workers in the last spring. So now one point I just mentioned is that, and the reason that I think instead of saying yes, we've reached a crisis and the art is over, or no, it continues on and it's over, is that much of Occupy was anticipated consciously and unconsciously in a lot of the most interesting contemporary art of the past 10 years. Think about Hirshhorn, Sharon Hayes, Alora and Calzadilla, the whole field of social practices, a lot of the things that Anton and Julieta worked on in terms of time banking, alternative economies, these things were already in the air. And research-based documentary practices, a huge field, the work of MTL, who I think we have some artists from that collective here with us tonight, who also helped who started the magazine title. So the point is that it's not as if there's Occupy as a movement and then artists came along and got involved, or because that Mason article sort of makes it sound like there's the movement and then someone like Mark Reed comes along and is like, oh, we're gonna like help out the movement. In fact, from the very beginning, since the very earliest conversations about Occupy in the summer of August 2011, artists were very deeply involved in it. And it has to do, I think, with opening a space of imagination that is not something the left has been great in the United States about for a long time. So it's no coincidence that there are already these intersections of contemporary art and Occupy from the very beginning. And I would identify 16 Beaver Group as a very important incubator for that emergence. So here I just wanted to go through this is the first, just the covers of the magazine title, which, as I said, was started by two artists who are here, Amin Hussain and Natasha Bhagat Singh. And I mean, it would be better for them to tell the story, but I'll just go quickly that it was something that emerged in the context of the park, not something that was external people commenting on what was going on the ground organizing, but something that was produced really by the folks occupying, but also drawing on certain high-profile figures in the intellectual and artistic field to have a dialogue about what this crack in capitalism was that was emerging in real time. And the first edition came out just after the eviction of the park in November, and right before the historic attempt to occupy Duarte Square and Canal Street. That occupation attempt then is featured on the cover of the second. And then the third, which we have copies of here, year 2 came out just before the 1-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. It's called year 2, and really used it as a kind of a kicking off platform for the discussion around debt. It's really become one of the main foci of Occupy organizers at the moment. So I just looked to title as an example of a practice that artists started, in which visual and aesthetic and graphic elements are really, really crucial. Which the tactile physicality of the magazine is a crucial aesthetic part of it as well. But it doesn't define itself in terms of art. It doesn't. It takes advantage of certain artistic platforms, which we'll show in a moment. It has ongoing dialogue with the art world, some of the resources that can be mobilized there. So it's not like, art is dead, and now we have this new avant-garde thing. It's a very fluid spectrum, and it's kind of a tactical thing where in certain cases, engaging with the space of art can be really critical and productive. So this is, I think this is an example of a hybrid practice that is both, I would see it in a certain lineage of contemporary art, but obviously it breaks out of that frame in a major way as well because it's the primary, one of the primary platforms for the intellectual discourse of the movement. So, so this is something that I think is kind of a new form to examine. And then here's the fourth, which will be released at large very soon. Now, Title also provided the impetus for, this is after May Day last year, which some of you may remember. There was a huge build-up, tons of organizing, tons of learning went into that historic day. But afterwards, there wasn't really much of a strategy after the big day of action, despite these new collaborations that Occupy did with unions and immigrant groups. And so a discussion that emerged out of the folks working with Title, which was also associated with Occupy theory, was a series of assemblies, around making debt possibly the focus of a political movement. It starts out just in the same way that Occupy Wall Street did, starts out with just getting together, having conversations in public space, and starting to tell stories about what it is like to be indebted. Because a crucial feature of that psychologically and emotionally is to be isolated, to be ashamed, to be individualized. So this process of coming out, doing a kind of almost testimonial bearing witness to the experience of being indebted, was really a groundbreaking moment in getting this group called Strike Debt setting it in motion. So in any case, I know I'll move a bit more quickly here, but the point is that it came out of a dialogue with the Occupy Student Debt Campaign, with Occupy Theory, with Think Tank, with Occupy University, a whole bunch of different working groups and different entities in Occupy, getting together to kind of synergize their analyses and their skills to build up a debt resistance movement. With student debt being a really key focus, but also housing debt and the mortgage crisis being something that, of course, Occupy has been working on for a while. So as I go through these images, I'm going to move more quickly now because I don't have time to give you a full step-by-step. But woven into almost everything I'm going to show you are aesthetic experiments. Right? How do we visualize something as, on the one hand, abstract as debt, but on the other hand, something that's embodied and suffered in a very intimate and immediate way? How do debtors find one another in an image, in an experience, in an assembly, in an object, in a slogan? And how does that become a new kind of political identity? An important development in, let's say, the kind of iconography of Strike Debt was the borrowing of this red square from the infinite strike that was happening amongst Quebec students last summer, where the red square was taken as an emblem of us all being in the red. Right? This imminent subjugation to debt that the Quebecois students were experiencing was taken by student activists here and really started to share as a sort of uniform, as a kind of uniform symbol, but in the form of this wearable piece of felt. So it's actually very intimate, very bodily, very tactile, and also kind of irregular because you cut your own, but it's also a unifying emblem that links the body of the debtor to others in the space of the imagination and at the level of the body. So here's, so I'll go more quickly. Here, just this is the All in the Red student organization that was an important ingredient in the emergence of Strike Debt. Here were some of the slogans and the online memes that were circulated to great effect. This being one of the most sort of famous phrases, right? You are not alone. Here's the illuminator, which was talked about in the Paul Mason article. The original 99% bat signal here has been deployed in many different contexts, working with Strike Debt and other allies. Okay. And so Title was an important platform for launching this discussion around the time of the one-year anniversary. And an interesting phenomenon was the way in which the back cover, designed by R. Black, of what was called the invisible army of defaulters. Right? All of those of us, many of whom in this room probably, will never pay off our debts. Right? Like, you know you're not going to be able to pay off your debts. And yet we are in the shadows, and we're isolated, and we're scared. And so what does it mean to embrace that as a common condition and make that a condition of kind of militant refusal of the debt system? So you have this kind of this graphic image that evokes this army, and then there's an analysis of Strike Debt also that appeared in the pages of the magazine. But then this gesture of burning the debt statement actually becomes a performative ritual on the part of debtors. So over the course of the summer, there were these debt burning debt-burning rituals. And then these were in turn incorporated into the anniversary concert and assembly for September 17th, the one-year anniversary. Right? So there are some folks burning our debt to the 1%. This also coincided with the launch of the Debt Resisters Operations Manual that will soon be released in second edition. So the point is, the art, the big picture that I'm trying to get at here, all the aesthetic and symbolic and artistic dimensions of all this is all interwoven with the analysis, with the publishing, with the action, with the assembly. And that's what I'm trying to say is something I do think is new, qualitatively new in terms of the contemporary artistic field. You also have the elaboration of totally non-expert amateur props, right, for use in demonstrations like the debt folder. You have crazy things happening. But on the other hand, there's also in the formalized art world, such as at the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, all fall, they hosted a very nice series of seminars and teach-ins and assemblies about what it means to visualize debt, with artists such as Cassie Thornton, who's been a really great ally for Strike Day in the art world, and securing resources and opening spaces and having conversations and plugging more people in. 2 minutes? Okay. And also, our friend Martha Rossler is a friend of Strike Debt, and at the Creative Time Summit, and I'm flagging that again because that's one of these artistic platforms where there's a lot of possibility for this kind of work. Martha held aloft the Strike Debt, the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, as did Zizek, who was also there, which was nice as well. Now, the folks from Occupy Theory and Title also staged a kind of mini assembly about what it means to occupy theory, what it means, the relation of occupy to the art world, and someone had the aesthetic sense to hang up a Strike Debt flag in the corner, uncannily resembling the Malevich exhibition, of course, from 19, whatever it was. That coincided with the day of October 13th, which was a global day of action against debt and austerity. So a bunch of folks from the Creative Time Summit went, took their flags from the summit and their copies of Title, and went out and did a big series of direct action in March that evening. The next chapter here, and I'll be very quick about this, the Rolling Jubilee. Some of you may have heard about an initiative to purchase and abolish debt at pennies on the dollar. There's a whole secondary tertiary market where people's debt is sold. It's possible to buy it and eliminate it in large anonymous portfolios. And so there was a whole social media campaign that was rolled out, Aaron Bornstein being a really key actor in that, turned over here, to really have this go viral, right? To have it as a meme, as something people are excited about, as a kind of a mystery that then eventually becomes an important cultural event. In its own right, it was called the Peoples Bailout. It featured people from Fugazi, from The Daily Show, from a whole range of Occupy folks and certain progressive celebrities. Some people were trying to hate on it, and we just like, haters gonna hate. Our folks ended up on the cover of the New York Times, including the artist Thomas Goki. Right? So again, I mean, it seems like, oh, it's social media, it's active. In fact, this all goes back. These are practices and ideas really grounded in the experimental laboratories of contemporary art, is what I'm trying to say. Eventually, we raised $500,000. It's in the process now of the debt is being purchased. There'll be an action later next month. Here's the telethon with some of our special guests. This helped to develop Strike Debt chapters around the country, in different cities in Portland and Detroit. And then here was a kind of a cultural event we did at the very end of the year where we were sending out the letters, the first batch of letters to the debtors whose debt had been purchased. So that's the debt mystery here with the red squares. Right? So on the one hand, it's like a kind of a playful thing, whatever, but it actually, you can see it has a lineage that goes far back into the avant-garde with the regular red square. Then also we're developing a radical children's theater called Little Red Squares. Here we are performing an eviction defense theatrical performance in Judson Church, which again, another place, long-term history of the avant-garde. Think about it from your art history classes, right? Judson Church, crucial. Continues to be for Occupy and for its offshoots. And then finally, I'll just end on this beautiful picture. I hope everyone recognizes this from your students, art students, your colleagues and comrades at Cooper Union fighting against the introduction of tuition. And they really brought all of their artistic skills and vision to bear on the occupation of the clock tower at the end of last year. And they really remain an important sort of locus, I think, of student organizing for the whole city. To keep, and again, it's free education for all. It's not just them defending their own kind of little piece of the pie. They're making a bigger claim about debt and education that anyone involved in the arts and academia can certainly identify with, because so many of us indeed are precarious. But it's not just those with that kind of privilege. Debt is the tie that binds them at 100%, and it affects people all across the spectrum in different ways. Unequal ways. So I would just end with this example of some badass avant-garde art students who read all the stuff we read in contemporary art and then do this amazing installation that becomes a huge media event and is really representative for the anti-debt struggle and the free education struggle. Okay, so I'll end with that. Thanks, sorry to go on a little bit longer. So that was the point, just provide a bunch of images, throw a bunch of stuff out there, and let's see what this end of art thing means in light of all this, is the idea. Okay, thanks.
Last is Greg.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And thanks to all the organizers of tonight's panel. Thank you. Like Paul, I wrote my comments out and sort of in the same spirit, except I would add that there was an element of confusion I had in trying to organize my thoughts for the panel, because I realized very late in my thought process that this question about the death of art, the concept of death of art, it became increasingly unclear to me why this even matters, by which I mean whether anybody organizes their practice any longer in light of this concept. There are artists who have. I'm not sure that a lot of artists are using this as an organizing concept for understanding their practices. And Yates' presentation sort of affirmed that for me, right? There's almost nothing going on there. You talk about a break, about an end, but the idea of the death, that's sort of vanished as useless in thinking about the phenomenon. So, but from that, I then started to ask the following question. Okay, so the death of art is not all that useful in the self-understanding of contemporary practice. What about the art concept? Right, let's just suppose art is dead. And what that means is that we cannot understand our practices in light of that concept. So what? What difference does that make? Why is it so hard simply to give up a concept, the passing of which has been noted in various ways for, I don't think 2 centuries, by the way, but a century, right? Giving up the concept turns out to be hard, and the way in which we don't give up the concept, I think, is by holding on to another concept, which is the death of art. That's the way in which we hold on to the concept of art. This is a thought that confuses me. That's why I had to write it out. And I'll read it to you. Although I've written a lot, and I now think probably too much, on the theme of the death of art, I find the concept increasingly inscrutable. I know what it means for a cultural practice to cease to be meaningful, either because it falls out of the cultural repertoire, as is happening, for instance, to the practice of striking film prints of movies right now, which will make a difference to the way we experience movies, or because it becomes mere routine, like saying "have a good day" at the end of a conversation. If you listen to that set of words these days, they're in a kind of state of involution. They become a single sound, like "hagun," like this, right? It's the sound of the routinization of what was, for a while, a meaningful cultural practice. But this sense of a cultural practice ceasing to be meaningful, that can't be the meaning of art being dead, since art has become practically inescapable in recent years. And while the interpretation and consumption of it can't keep up with the flow of the product, the increasing volume of interpretation and consumption indicates that the practice of art has not become merely one of routine. The near ubiquity of art and its products in our everyday worlds must be what's behind the, it seems to me, very peculiar thought expressed by Paul Mason, his idea that the aesthetic and artistic dimensions of Occupy somehow signal the death of contemporary art. Although the significance of Occupy is yet to play itself out enough for anyone to draw a conclusion about its consequences, one would think that with its openly political ambitions, what it would represent the end of would be, say, the hegemony of neoliberalism. How one could come to care about the impact of Occupy on the gallery system is, it seems to me, risible. But art is not simply ubiquitous. It's like kudzu. Anybody who's spent any time in the South knows what this means. It's like kudzu. Where anything grows now, art grows too, and faster than that other thing. And somehow, through the prism of its fate, we espy the fate of the other practices it enshrouds. But this is a sign that art is not a dead practice, but rather a fervidly, scrappingly healthy one. Such was also the sentiment expressed by the Dadaists when they declared, for instance, die Kunst ist tot, es lebe die neue Maschinenkunst Tapens, right? Art is dead, long live the new machine art of Tappen. The practice in the name of which art is declared dead, the practice liberated by the death of art, is machine art. Art is dead, long live art. Art is unkillable. But what I find most inscrutable about the sentiment is not the superficial thought that art is dead, but the underlying thought that art ever was alive. Although Hegel never said that art had died, never said this, rather that it was, he said, art was and remained on the side of its highest destiny, a thing of the past, which is a much different thought. He nonetheless revealed that the myth of living works of art was an essential part of the way the practice of art lives on in its post-classical afterlife, if you will, in the age, that is, of its self-awareness as a practice with its own autonomous values and ambitions. It's a mythic weight it throws in its past. From this point of view, it becomes thinkable that the life of art is a kind of backward formation that enables art to die again and again, to remain, in other words, perpetually undead, so that post-artistic practices can remain vital, innovating the same fate. The death of art is, we might say, a meme of contemporary artistic consciousness, in which is distortedly expressed a discontent with the increasing artistic encrustation of the contemporary world. Better, not just a meme, it's a zombie idea. And since the content of the idea is zombiehood itself, you might even say it's a meta-zombie idea. Its importance lies not in its truth value as such, but in its special place in zombie self-reflection. Now, it's because zombies have become ubiquitous also in contemporary culture, nearly as ubiquitous as art, but not quite. There's something both cheap and meta-meta in my recruiting them into the project of making the death of art intelligible, that is, metabolizing it, digesting it, as zombies do. Although I realized when I wrote that, I don't know if zombies digest or not. I know that they eat, but I don't know if they digest. Anyway. But the contemporary zombie figure is actually a pretty good image for the undeadness of art. In its first significance, the zombie was a figure of Vodun magic, a dead person reanimated by witchcraft. Scary enough, but really nothing more than an embodiment of Walter Benjamin's idea that we live in an age when not even the dead are safe. But the contemporary zombie is not just reanimated. The contemporary zombie is back for blood. To the return of the dead, we have added undying hunger. And by the way, if you look at the first appearance of the zombie as a cultural figure, it's got nothing to do with flesh eating, right? This is a later addition, a kind of overlay. So, to the return of the dead, we have added undying hunger, so that now our zombies are flesh-eating zombies. The zombie is, in other words, not just undead, but what life looks like when it's reduced to frank and implacable need. The zombie is embodied need when need's fateful entry into the web of social norms is taken off the table. Looked at this way, you might say, the zombie is the negation of Don Fabrizio's thought in Lampedusa's The Leopard, that, as he put it, where there's death, there's hope. As Don Fabrizio is the prince of Salina, no doubt his thought is lifted from the folk wisdom of the long downtrodden peasantry, as is most aristocratic insight. The thought is that wherever suffering seems eternal, their death is the reminder that nothing on earth is eternal. Let the souls of the dead go to heaven as long as they leave the earth to us. Death is the radical outside of hegemonic systems that pretend to close off all alternatives. As radical outsideness, death offers the prospect of nothing but hope. Precisely because no program flows from it, the melancholy aristocrat of Lampedusa's novel can also take comfort in it. But the figure of the zombie undermines even this source of hope. For where death is, there old needs gather and swarm. For us, not even death represents hope. I'll wrap up in just a moment with a different way to think of the hope represented by death in the context of the zombie meme of the death of art, but I'll make my conclusion a little more provocative if I first acknowledge that there's another way to understand the contemporary flesh-eating zombie precisely as a figure of hope. I said above, and I'm quoting myself here, the zombie is embodied need when need's fateful entry into the web of social norms is taken off the table. This is why, by the way, all the zombie movies about societies of zombies are unsatisfying, right? And there's a new zombie movie out now called Warm Bodies, which I haven't seen yet, in which apparently zombies can fall in love, right? So we're seeing the decline. So I said above that the zombie is embodied need when need's fateful entry into the web of social norms is taken off the table. I mean by that the zombie is the figure in which is embodied our horror at human need, that it may not be adequately mediated by social norms. But one might turn that thought right around and say that that's precisely what's hopeful about the figure of the zombie. For in it, we imagine a moment of hunger utterly outside of social appropriation. The zombie, in this sense, represents the conjunction of social death and undying human need. The conjunction that for the Marxist left has been expressed in the thought of the proletariat as simultaneously the inside and the outside of capitalism, the conjunction of social death and undying need. The zombie will not lay down in exchange for a bag of food. It wants life, which is the one thing it cannot have. I think Joe Strummer captured this when he called out to the zombies of death to, as he put it, quit holding out and draw another breath. The zombie in this light is a figure which both embodies the limit of a social order and the imagination of its recommencement. And so with art. The undeadness of art rests not on an earlier life, but rather on our need to imagine the outside of what we have now, to hope for it in the form of what cannot die. Let me wrap up then in an unexpected place. If the opening salvo of the, am I all right for time? Just 2 minutes. If the opening salvo of the war between art and philosophy was Plato's denunciation of the cognitive and practical corruption art both is and induces, it's worth remembering that the context of that denunciation is the intersection of political and pedagogical themes that we call the Republic. Republic was the Ciceronian translation of a Platonic text called Politeia, probably better translated as politics or constitution, perhaps even citizenry, although that's anachronistic also. But Cicero's was not merely a mistaken translation, for he was emphasizing the thought that Plato's ambition was to constitute in words something held in common by all members of the polis, something, as we might put it, held in public. In this light, Plato's ambition was to expel the arts from public life, to expel them from public life. Given that the ancient Greeks had no supplemental normative category of private life, such an expulsion was expulsion to core. That the arts kept coming back was thus a sign of their zombification from the get-go. But we should also remember that the lack of any place inside the Republic for what Plato needed to expel from it did not mean that there was no outside to the Republic. perhaps we should spend a few moments contemplating the barbarians, those who were never expelled from the Republic because they never had hope of membership in it to begin with. Did they have hope of something else? We won't learn from Plato, nor from the arts, insofar as they retreat into private life. Perhaps the time has come to conjure a new war of the barbarians against the zombies, to see if hope takes shape on that battlefield.
All right, there was some common themes, although radically different presentations. So I'll give the panelists the opportunity, if they wish, to respond to anything they thought was worth responding to or to carry on a conversation. So we could just begin with the order we began at Tom.
Can I be the second one? I just need
Sure.
to check something. And then I will respond.
By all means.
I just, there's something I just remembered from what you were kind of reminded me of in your talk, so I will make sure that I'm correct before I do.
Oh, Paul, do you have anything?
I don't.
Yeah, please no comment.
Yeah, just want to say to Julieta, guitar or civil or cyborg or whatever it is that you're doing for that. I thought that the point in the Mason article makes this very problematic opposition between there's the contemporary art world over here, it's all the Damien Hirsts, it's all the 1%, blah, 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 and then there's this new thing that is really engaged with the movement and it is this whole new breakthrough, and I thought that it was nice to break that down on religious projects. Indeed, as I tried to point as well, a lot of the most exciting currents of artistic and cultural production in Occupy are in a very intensive and fruitful dialogue with what's been going on in other sectors of contemporary art. Because contemporary art is not a single monolithic thing, obviously. And the things that are most prominent are the $1 million blockbusters and so on, but it's really, contemporary art has been an amazing laboratory of thought, of research, of experimentation, of relationship building, of alternative economies. And so I'm really glad that she pointed that out. And also the point about reproduction in life. And this is a term I would have flagged for everybody. I think it hit on something we all address. That why do we want to dwell so much on the death? There's a kind of morbidity there. There's a kind of like almost necrophilia, you could say. That's also related to zombies. And one thing that occupies very much about is how do we live? Right? How do we live together? How do we struggle together? What are the conditions for reproducing our lives on a day-to-day basis? The park is an experiment in living, but it also speaks very much to this one part of people who are largely precarious in different ways. But it also speaks to this point that Witte brought up as well about how do you sustain yourself economically as a cultural producer? And that's been a big. There's been a lot of movement in and around Occupy, around trying to create solidarity economies between cultural workers. Thinking about alternative economies, thinking about communes, collectives, mobilizing around things like unpaid internships, the working conditions from gallery girls to art handlers to adjunct professors, and also trying to construct new resource pools to be able to sustain the movement and its offshoots. There's a lot of cultural capital and economic capital crystallized in the art world. And the process of communizing that, I think, is a really historic path that we're looking at.
Have you found your source, Anthony?
No, not yet, but of course, anytime death is dumped into kind of a conversation about anything, could be art, could be another field, it's going to dominate, yeah? Because in the end, this is the one thing that is particularly so kind of expelled from contemporary culture. Like in the Victorian time, death was all over the place. There were skulls everywhere. The image of death was always present in life. Yeah, we've managed to exile it to horror movies, to zombie movies, yeah, to cinema, but we actually expelled it as much as we can. But the reality is, we are all dying. We're sitting here, we're kind of on our way to that state that is on the table. And of course, it's a kind of a really interesting thing, and particularly zombies, because what I was looking for is, a while ago, I came across an essay that basically zombies were actually representations of communism in American cinema. Yeah, that the zombie was this kind of a communist, yeah, the great threat, yeah, expressed in this kind of mindless communal thing, yeah, right? I'm completely serious, yeah, this is the image. As opposed to vampire. Vampire is something entirely different, also immortal creature, yeah, but it's a romantic figure, yeah, it's maybe comes out of some kind of German idealism or something like that. But, you know, the interesting thing is, like, where do zombies really come from, yeah? And zombies come from, apparently in 1957 or 1958, there was a very low-budget film made, right, where an American spaceship goes to Venus, yeah, and it comes back with something, yeah, something which appears to be some kind of dead bodies that were found on Venus that come back to life, right? And this is really very, very interesting for me because I'm reading a lot. I spent the last 6 months or so researching into a philosophy which is not very well known, which is called Russian Cosmism, which was a late 19th century, early 20th century philosophical and artistic field of vast proportions, you know. It included virtually just about any avant-garde artist you had ever heard of, from Malevich to Rodchenko to whoever half the inner members of the Communist Party, including Trotsky and so forth, hundreds and hundreds of scientists, physicists, chemists, philosophers. It was a kind of a brainchild, intellectual brainchild of a philosopher called Nikolai Fedorovich, which is kind of a one-idea philosophy, that all we need to do to solve all the world's problems is overcome death, become immortal. And if society completely reorients itself to a very kind of a single-minded person, just one person, yeah, to become immortal and resurrect the dead, yeah, because ethically we owe the obligation, like it would be too selfish to just become immortal ourselves and forget about our parents, yeah, because they kind of gave us the gift of life, so we need to bring them all back, you know, from Adam onwards, you know, billions of them, yeah, but this of course brings up a very complex question: where do they all live? Yeah? So that was the reason for the Russian space program, yeah, because it was realized that we need to expand ourselves throughout the universe, colonize other planets, create places for all of this kind of resurrected creatures. So this is what the zombies are. They come back because Venus has been colonized, clearly. Yeah, they come back here. But this is a kind of a very, very fascinating, let's say, territory, which also includes art, because I think Russian Cosmism was almost synonymous with communism. Yeah, it dovetailed it, intertwined with it. There are a lot of common ideas about dematerialization of life and many, many, many things. And it was the only movement where I saw artists participate in a way beyond designing posters or banners for a demonstration. Yeah, because personally, as an artist, I've always been kind of alienated by the political processes that always take for granted that my role is to design t-shirts. You know? Right? So for me, this period and the Communist Revolution and the subsequent period is one period where artists were actually able to participate in really radical ways, and ways much more meaningful than aesthetical design or propaganda production and so forth. So I think I've said way too much in a very simple comment. So I think I should just stop.
Well, okay, I just have to say one thing about the zombies. It's one more thing about the zombies. It is interesting that the figure of the zombie became, in the 50s, a figure of the brainwashed person. And in that respect, American communists were
somebody
zombies.
lacking individualism, yeah,
Right.
because communism is collective, it's collective consciousness.
But they weren't yet flesh eaters.
Yeah, they
Right.
started in flesh.
They started-
In this article, yeah, it says that they started in flesh a bit later.
They started, yeah, a little bit later they started eating flesh. In the 60s they started eating flesh. But it's interesting that somehow, but this is the point, that the idea that brainwashing is still too sort of intellectualist a conception of the meaning of this undead spirit. It's got to take over the body and take over its needs in order for the figure to do the full kind of cultural work doesn't. And this seems to me to be an idea that's connected to the difference between the idea of the death of art, which is the theme that was set for us.
But of course, there's another. Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Just I came to me, and I must say.
No, that's all right. I'll repay the favor
There is
later.
also animism. Yeah, an art object is the ultimate. This is a very good example of something that is inorganic, that is dead matter. Yeah, that is supposed to encapsulate feelings and affections and thoughts and right. So this is this perfect zombie in a sense. Yeah, that moves, that's animated, that animates you. Rather than, so it's interesting to talk about the death of something which essentially is already dead.
It's already, yeah, no, this is my point. And so I'll just make one brief point in following up that opened up. That I think it can be mapped onto Paul's comments, I think, in interesting ways. The initial claim, it seems to be the key claim of the 19th century, theorists of the passing of art, is not that art is dead. I actually don't know where that thought is to be found in the 19th century. I've explored it a little bit. If anybody has examples, I'd like to know. The thought is that art is a thing of the past, and in that respect, it's connected to the overcoming of animism. Right? Art is a thing of the past to the extent to which animism is a thing of the past. Right? And that's why art recedes into the past. That doesn't mean it's dead. In a way, that means it's liberated for the first time to serve the kinds of functions ascribed to it by the ascended bourgeoisie. It has to be ripped away from the animistic context to be able to do this kind of ideological work. And it's only once it's able to do this kind of ideological work, and it is ideological work, right? It's not really reanimating work, it's ideological work. Once it does that, then I think the question opens up: what what are the internal contradictions in what we or different social fractions want art to accomplish? And then it becomes a social question of real dimension, I think. But it's only after art becomes a thing of the past, which is to say, once it retreats into animism, and what's left behind is now a naked social practice. Without the kind of animism support.
Like every time I go to my parents, I tend to watch some TV because there is no television from. And the moment like the TV turns on and some kind of sponges stuff into bottles, I mean, it's like this incredible commercial animistic universe of like kind of insane scenarios. And I'm just like looking at my parents thinking, you're watching that all day?
All day. The past
is incredible. So animism is like kind of...
It never goes away.
It never goes away.
It never goes away. I'll stop.
I think an important term to bring here to allude to in the text that's the, let's say, less melancholic and less negative dialectical, maybe, or maybe it's exactly that is the Debordian thing, right? Of Dada abolished art without realizing it. Surrealism realized art without abolishing it, right? So that's this grand creative thing, right? If you could abolish and realize art simultaneously together, what would you get? The full presence of life, right? Like life praxis would be the Debordian principle. Now, I've always been very skeptical of it as a kind of humanist figure, that you can never just get back to just being living here and now, you know? But I wonder if there's another way to think about that relationship between art and life. Like life more, and I'm sorry to be jargony, but like biopolitics, like life as a practice of like sustaining, supporting networks of life that are precarious, that are vulnerable, that are subjected to capital, and then reclaiming that notion of life. Somehow the kind of crisis or break that I'm talking about from the regular field of contemporary art, moving into the sphere of biopolitical reproduction, that's something new, I think. Like the idea of the camp as a biopolitical space of producing life against.
So there were camps which were biopolitical spaces of exterminating life.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it goes both ways, and that's part of the power of that picture of the tent, right? And of the is that it evokes the precariousness of life, right? So anyway, so that, and then also incidentally, there's zombies all over the place in Occupy. And in fact, the students who came out with the All in the Red students, their first event was Night of the Living Dead, and they're all dressed up like zombies. Right? There's also a thing about zombies in Capital, zombie banks, you know. So there's something, there's something deep there, in the kind of like zeitgeist or something. I don't know.
All your last opportunity. Does anyone have questions? All right, we'll start with, what are you over there? You.
Okay, well, I think, the zombie image is interesting. I was just reminded by Tana here that we read this article that was talking about the origin of like zombie figures. They're not flesh-eating at the beginning, obviously, but that in Haiti, there was this idea that the slaves wouldn't pass into their sort of final resting place if they committed suicide. It was largely enforced by the masters, as you would imagine, because suicide would be to some extent a form of like proto-political resistance against them being property or whatever. But and so that they would become these zombies, these sort of like eternally hungry figures that would just roam and never pass into their afterlife. And I thought that there was something maybe in connection just to what you said in terms of like in this sense, like the passing of the zombie figure, like in that world, would have actually meant like kind of redemption of a life of some sort. And it seemed to be connected to this dialectic that you were working through your paper, Greg, about death as being a way of claiming a new life to something, or the relationship between that. Because I know that Yates, you were like kind of emphasizing like, well, what about the sort of presence of life and the living of you said, I think, the full present, or the time that's filled, feeling time that says filled. And I thought that there was an interesting kind of opposition maybe in thinking about declaration of the time of now being over in order to create a radical break for the possibility of something new and what that means versus asserting life, asserting the sustainability of life, asserting that we can create these networks to like preserve life. And because it seems actually sort of conservative in relationship to a definite break with the present. And I think I agree, this is like my last sort of figuration of the question, I think I agree when you said, Greg, that in a sense death offers the prospect of nothing but hope insofar as if one declares something to be dead, the possibility is that it could in fact mean something completely different. It can in fact sort of like be taken up in a totally new way. The question, I think, would be why, and how would that new meaning take place in the present, and whether or not we have the tools and the capacities to make something new out of what art is, and if not, why declare it dead at all? So my question, I guess, would be this sort of opposition, affirming the death of something, the end of something, in order to proclaim something new, that the end of something today, to declare, to accept it, to feel it, to make it palpable, may actually make way for the possibility of something new, something consciously new, versus thinking of sustaining something that's there, rescuing it, saving it, resisting against its potential demise, being able to hold on to it, and why one would be sort of counterposed against the other.
If I can jump in. It seems to me the problem, I actually think you raised an interesting issue, is the problem that you can't just declare an end to things. You can say, capitalism is over, but then of course it doesn't become over because you said that. And that's why, and actually to produce an end to a social system, it's an enormous undertaking involving hundreds of millions or billions of people. So that means that you are stuck then doing very mild things like trying to reduce the debt burden or get interns a little bit of money, right? Which is, seems to me, it's rather grandiloquent to describe that as a radical break with the way things are, to have a fairer deal for young people who are working at low pay. So this is not altering society or ushering in a radical break any more than it would be to raise the minimum wage to $9 an hour. But you can see that people are, as you say, there you are. You're still in capitalism. You're still in the same system. You have to somehow live with it and then preserve life or make it a little better. And there's a tension between the sense, which I think was enacted at the moment of Occupy, the whole thing is no good and has to go, right? This was what was so beautiful about the refusal to make demands, because you don't ask the 1% to give up their social position. They're pointless. Either you can take it away from them, or you just have to accept that they have it. So, but once that moment passes, and because you are not in a position, being a few thousand people, to make a social change, then you have to, on the one hand, fall back into trying to ameliorate things and to preserve life and to make it a little bit better, while still thinking. You can still try to think, well, what would be necessary to actually create the kind of enormous change that you originally found yourself speaking for. So I think that tension is, in a way, inescapable. The problem is that the reality of the practical necessities of trying to actually accomplish some small changes are so gigantic and take up so much energy that it's very hard. Historically, this has always been the problem of left-wing movement, that once they attempt to actually try to be effective in the real world, they immediately become less radical.
I mean, if I just a quick follow-up, that like what you were describing, the lack of being able to mediate something like a revolutionary versus a kind of reformist politics. I mean, I would just like to point out that that seems to be kind of key into thinking about how to mediate things like small gains and a radical activity. If that isn't happening, the question would be why. And I think that we need the sphere of art. We have to talk about that question.
Yes, I think that's true.
So Greg, do you have a direct response to that question? Yeah.
Oh, okay. So.
Oh, yeah, you were next. And then I'll have you next. After.
So this question is related to Yates' opening presentation, but anybody can answer it. The passage that you read from the title at the beginning used the phrase like not being tied to the past and don't look back, and like then during your comments you talked about there being a crack in capitalism, and then also you used the phrase like avant-garde politics. But to me, most of the political practice that you spoke about, from the burning of the debt, I guess they're like people's promissory notes, I don't know, documents, like that seems to directly reference like the burning of the draft cards, even the imagery. And then also like the consciousness raising circles, which are like that people aren't alone in their position, seems to also be another like direct reference to the women's movement, and then also like the civil rights movement. And then just kind of even the way that the posters look, like either are referencing like the Bolshevik Revolution or are referencing like 60s kind of new lefty stuff. So it seems like there's a deliberate attempt to reference the past, but then also in what you read, say, was talking about like not looking back. And I'm wondering what is the importance in not looking back? To me, it would seem like it's very important to look back because, we're still living in capitalism. There's no revolutionary politics to speak of right now. But yet it seems like Occupy kind of got in this position where they're repeating these same activities of the new left or like referencing the old left. So I'm just wondering if you can address that.
Yeah. Well, definitely the importance of historical memory and intergenerational dialogue can't be overstated, and that's something Title and Occupy more generally is constantly thinking about generations, lessons from the past, for movements around the world, right, ranging from ACTA to Black Panthers to radical labor struggles, et cetera, and that's something that's a very intentional thing. The point, and also evoking stylistically or symbolically some of those tropes is definitely occurs. But there's also a real diversity of visual strategies as well. So I wouldn't focus solely on the ones that, as it were, look back. But the particular phrase "look back," in the context that I read it, was really about resisting a melancholy, right? Because it's in the context of kind of where things are now, recognizing that the park, the occupation of the park, was a crack, it was a rupture. It created a new kind of space, but that we no longer have the park. And it's not something you can count on. It's not something where you can ever really exactly recreate that moment. So the question is how to, let's say, respond to and be adhere to the lessons or the demands of that moment.
Can I interject? What do you mean by the park is a new kind of space in a crack? Like if you could unpack that a little.
Okay, so we want to talk about it in terms of direct action, right? The principle of direct action of living and caring for one another in a way without the mediation of the state, without the mediation of capital, as something that really intervened in the taken for grantedness of capitalism, that intervened in the taken for grantedness of people being alone and being isolated, and also generating an image, generating opening an imagination about how to live differently. Right? It's a kind of prefigurative politics, that's a term probably heard. But it really, I mean, people say, okay, well, it changed the conversation, it changed the horizon, inequality is back on the table, the 99% versus the 1%. But it's not just about that. It's also about actually practicing a kind of alternative form of living relative to one another. That's where the resistance comes in, along with the bigger messaging around, again, like targeting Wall Street, targeting the 1%. It's also about the actual practicing. How do you live, right? And so, when in the statement that I read, the point about not looking back is not being nostalgic for the park, not being nostalgic for that moment of being everybody physically present together at that moment. But it's also about left melancholy for the whole left, right? Because the whole left is always attached to lost ideals. In fact, its identity is often parasitically dependent on the fact that things don't radically change. And so that's also something that we at Occupy really disrupted. Because we're experimenting, we're learning by doing. This is a form of training, this is a form of kind of a practical pedagogy. And it's like, it's a long-term, it's not something that's going to generate the type of revolutionary effect that the left has often dreamt about in one fell swoop, right? And so that's why critics of Occupy often you'll find end up having every kind of negative critique from every angle. And then you're like, okay, so what's your strategy? What's your mode of organizing? What's your mode of experimenting and practicing? They're like, you just got some theory we want to throw at you. So Occupy theory is all about deconstructing an opposition and really learning by doing. And that's really the education, the pedagogy, the learning process is a really key component of the whole sort of Occupy experience. But yeah, not looking back doesn't mean don't be historical, don't remember, etc., but it means don't be dominated by the past, whether it be the past of Occupy or the past of the whole left. Because the left has this tendency to fixate melancholically on the fact that nothing ever changes.
I think we need to kind of differentiate Western leftism and the other part of the world where there was no melancholy. Nobody was dreaming that she needed a revolution.
We'll take
no lament.
Yeah, it's
So they probably miss their health insurance now that it's gone.
Now that it's gone. So it's interesting. The panel was set up as its first provocation was the Paul Mason article, which we can return to it again. I think the idea is so absurd that Paul Mason was pregnant that for me the only interesting question is how could he get caught in that absurdity? It's not trying to retrieve the truth from it. We might do that eventually.
Who is Paul Mason? Is this somebody I should know?
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote the thing that is here, a writer or a philosopher, a critic?
Just a reporter. This would be interesting.
Shouldn't aren't we giving him too much importance?
I was about to make a move. Right? I was about to make a move away from that. But the second question has the following question embedded in it. Would art even be possible in the absence of the left? Now this seems to me to be a sort of interesting question, which is not what do we mean by art, what do we mean by the death of art, what do we mean by the left? and I want to ask this in a non-melancholy spirit, ask this question. The idea that nostalgia for the park is on the horizon, how long ago was this?
A year ago.
A whole year ago, right? This seems to me to betoken the fact that Occupy, which is admirable in all sorts of ways, is not yet a political movement. If a year is a space in which nostalgia could perch, then we don't have a politics yet. And this, I want to make this point more broadly. What it means to say that the left is attached to melancholy, I actually don't know what that even refers to right now. The problem is not that we lack revolutionary politics. We should be so lucky as to lack revolutionary politics. What we lack is politics. Period. Plain and simple. And we don't know how to make sense, I think, of the way in which the political space has collapsed around us. So that what we have right now is I think, this may be a break, this may be something new, where it's a kind of unbelievably naked capitalism right now. It's capitalism almost without a political edifice. It's got a military, that's for sure, but it's almost got no political edifice about it. So it's hard to figure out what it would mean to engage with it in that light. And this is why I don't mean this. It sounds negative, I totally don't mean it that way. In that light, all sorts of experiments in new ways of being together are required, not because they're political, but because they're not. Now, I want to say that it seems to me that if that's right, and that's overstated in all sorts of ways, granted, if that's right, then this question about what art would be possible in the emphasis of the left becomes, I think, really pressing. Paul made reference to the Borduvian idea of modernism, modernist art, being the art of the dominated fraction of the dominating class. This suggests a space of politics in a contradiction within that class. And there were all sorts of ways in which that contradiction was given form by the art of the dominated fraction. Right? This, I think, is T.J. Clarke's genius, is to find the way in which that contradiction was given form. But if there's not a contradiction like that, then the prospect of giving it form, the prospect of art in the sense that I take it many of us care about, is not even on the table. So we're going to get really great posters and banners. But that next development in which there's a kind of encoded politics, that still seems to me unapproached. And the demonstration of I mean, I hope Occupy becomes nostalgia. Let that nostalgia flower. Right? What was that missed moment?
Well, one of the people that used to work at e-flux, who was very, very deeply involved in Occupy, who was in her sort of early mid-20s, basically summarized the whole thing in a really strange sentence, which said that basically Occupy ran out of brand. Yeah, that it exhausted its brand. Yeah, which I thought was the most peculiar thing to say about something that actually has the aspiration to be a political movement. But it's interesting. You know, it's a kind of, is that all it was?
Oh, it's partly true. I mean, it wasn't just that it ran out
And
of
this is a
friends.
sympathizer. This is not
Yeah,
not
no, I
a
understand.
sympathizer, but somebody that was there all the time. Yeah.
Friends.
Friends? You said?
Brand.
Oh,
Brand.
brand. Oh, I thought you said friend.
Like a
But it exhausted its brand.
Yeah, that's
I don't think
a very bizarre way of
I
talking.
don't think it ran out of friends.
Yeah.
The friends are kind of
No, but in a way it did, because when the governments decided the government decided to crush it, and then no one defended it, so it was crushable because it was too small. It was really easy to crush. So I thought that in that sense it ran out of friends. The number of people who were interested and able and willing to participate in this kind of action was too small, and so it was very easy to disperse them. But what you said is actually shocking in its naivete and stupidity. It's true.
It's not a stupid person, but it's a very strange.
But the sentence is very,
I'm going to crush
very
this
weird.
line of thought here, actually. We do have more questions. There's a gentleman in the back that had a question, and then I will go to the gentleman in the far back. By all means.
Hi. My question would be addressed to all. Many these days would judge that a discussion centered on predicament of art and aesthetic autonomy must acknowledge at least the nearly hegemonic position of Jacques Rancière, praised by some, for instance, Thomas Hirschhorn, to have resolved the main question of this kind of debates. Indeed, he himself, Rancière, declared that debates of this kind are beside the point, a proclamation that is used by artists and critics alike as a substantiation for what is called semi-autonomy or relative autonomy of art. Art whose symbolic elevation allows for the progressive articulation, a blank slate of sorts, that is called the redistribution of the sensible. That operates at the same time in a paradoxical space of self-critical examination and negation, and that carries, as it were, within its body a kernel of its own dissolution into life. So in other words, one might put it that a panel such as this one is exactly a symptom of critical vigor that underlies articulations that model art.
What was the last point?
That panels such as this one is a example of critical vigor that underlies articulations surrounding art.
I have to say, I hate to give credit to Jacques Rancière, who I find a pretty dull fellow. I am happy to be a whatchamacallit of critical vigor. I like that very much. So I think we should claim that banner of critical vigor. That's a very nice phrase. And I'm glad to exemplify it.
Does anyone
Rancière is really helpful for this kind of expanded field of aesthetic practices that I was referring to, that many of them emerge out of a dialogue with contemporary art, but don't restrict themselves either to criteria of aesthetic autonomy or to the institutional sort of frames and spaces of art. I think that my presentation may have failed if I gave the impression that the relation between the end of art and Occupy is about making banners. It's exactly not that. Like, there are people who make the banner, and like there is a kind of play between the uniformity sometimes of the logo that people will use, and then people's own sort of individual practices. But the point is that Occupy is exactly aesthetic politics in the Rancièrean sense, the distribution of the sensible, right? The rethinking of what you can see, what you can hear, what you can feel. Right?
And maybe you should show images during your presentation, because what you're showing is banners and posters, and maybe this gives the wrong idea. This is not a criticism.
No. Well, that's, I mean, something like it's something like an assembly, for instance, right? Or like a Rolling Jubilee project, or a a tactical intervention in Genova or at MoMA. Right? Those aren't banners and posters. Those are people working together to intervene in space and to reclaim it momentarily, to start to push forward demands in a much more movement-specific way. I think you're right. Occupy itself, not a movement, right? It's a crack, it's a rupture, it's a verb, it's not a thing. The moment, I think that speaks to the point, the moment it starts to get fixed as a brand or a thing, that's when it starts to lose its vitality, if you can speak in definition. But strike debt, and also if you look at something like Occupy Sandy, right? These are things that are not just, there's the crack and then the experience. These are things that are pushing forward, new kinds of organizing, making new sites of life, like for instance the condition of indebtedness, into a political subjectivity. And that's a very Rancièrean thing. So when you have thousands of people wearing a red felt thing, this isn't a banner or a poster, right? This is a way of linking others in debt who are isolated and ashamed into a kind of imagined community. So I think that's a little bit of a canard to say, that somehow that the work, this is merely a matter of propaganda. It's like, it's Rancièrean. It's a redistribution of the sensible. what's visible, what's audible, etc. So I find Ranzia really helpful in getting outside the trap of like, how does this conform or not to a given aesthetic, a given artistic or historical model? It's just like people do what they need to do. That's the thing. It's just like it's driven by. It's a very pragmatic, pragmatism. It's driven by learning and doing and experimenting by any means necessary. And it doesn't really matter what art historians think about it. It's
But also for me, I don't really feel this kind of pressure on the Francia. There are so many other writers that, in terms of my work and my interest, are so much more, you know.
Yeah, that was the wrong word. But at least in this very problematic, his presence is looming of this aesthetic autonomy.
All right, well, I'm going to move on. Let me show everyone who wants to ask a question, raise. All right.
Well, that's
All right, so what I'm going to do is
Overtime kicks in really
Does it? Well, we have to be mindful of that. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'll take a few questions at a time. I have the gentleman in the back picked out, then I will go here, and then the young lady over there.
So a question or thought about zombies to whoever would like to answer, since you all seem as interested in the topic.
Just speak up a little bit.
Sure. So this idea of zombies, and to take farther your thought, Greg, about the logic of zombie desire, which is to say, a logic of desire which is not human, and that it's not being human constitutive of it being zombie desire. So this perverse thought of, terrifying thought of zombies falling in love with each other, right? So they're mastering their crude naturalistic desire. These zombies have read Hegel, and now they're falling in love with each other. So which is to say that it involves our relationship with zombies, involves something unmastered about our own desire, which is to say a failure on the part of our concepts to think through our own desire. And that made me think about another point you mentioned about Plato, which is a case of concepts being used in a slightly different way. And your reference to the Republic made me think about something which I think you all shared, which is this idea of the arts as a coherent subject called a concept. And I don't think this is to be assumed, right? So this idea of a concept, which is to say a historical fact, that the arts are not distinguished from another on account of formal or essential qualities, but rather through a concept which separates them and unifies them. And this seems to me what Plato is doing in the examples that you, Greg, brought up in regards to the Republic, that the banishing of art from the Republic is a way of making art intelligible and coherent as a social practice, which is to say that as a social practice, it becomes intelligible at the point in which it depends on concepts through its resisting them to doing that. So the question, two questions I guess that I would ask are, one, in this relationship between art and concepts, what use was this for art on a material basis, which is as opposed to a conceptual level? And I guess related to that, it's a way of asking the question of what the zombies can take from our inquiry about that.
So I'm hoping you all register this question because I'm going to have to answer
all the questions.
Yeah, I figured since we're in overtime right now.
I'm sure, it's difficult, I'm sure, to retain all these questions. It can often be easy to miss things that you all have said in your presentations. But my question is primarily for Professors Horowitz and Maddock. Professor Horowitz, I think you said in your presentation that where death is, old weeds gather. And I'm wondering how we might understand this kind of in light of some of the other presentations in regards to how that actual new or the potential for the new might be embedded in those old needs. And then likewise how what actually appears as new is old. And so how we might understand that dynamic, particularly in light of kind of the, I guess, totalizing domination of capital in society that continuously, repeatedly subsumes like the appearance of the new as it kind of flares up. So I guess it's kind of how to understand this dynamic of old and new in terms of the potential for political organization or potential for actually an actual new today.
All right, I'll be generous and keep it at the 2, and then I'll take you after the panelists respond.
Well, I just have a quick historical note on Plato, since you brought him up, the old zombie, which is to say that Plato wants to banish not art and art. Plato wants to banish poets. And Plato does not have anything like the modern concept of art in mind. And he explicitly, in fact, distinguishes poetry from the crafts, because poetry involves an aspect of genius which cannot be taught, unlike the techne, what later on get called the arts. So he's really talking about something which is very specific, which has to do with the role of the poets, and particularly of Homer in Greek pedagogy and culture. And it's a very different discussion from the contemporary discussion of the relation of art and science. Pardon me?
Can I disagree?
Of course.
Because ultimately what is at stake there is the same question. His complaint is really about Homer, and the fact that how can he write, with the Odyssey, the Iliad, how can he write about war without being a general? How can he write about medicine without being a doctor? Where is the authority comes from? Where is the expertise of an artist? Isn't this the critique of contemporary art?
I don't think so, no. But that would take us off in another long tangent. But no, actually, I don't think so. I think the present issue that this woman raised is really crucial. This is the big problem of human history, is that, what does Marx say? That the past hangs like a millstone around our necks. So people make the French Revolution, they imagine that they are ancient Greeks and Romans. And it's people who try to act politically in the 21st century, and they think about Lenin and the Winter Palace. So I think this is a very important question. And partly, this is a value in the disappearance of historical memory. I would say that in a way, the almost complete extinction of the left as it existed in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, while it brings with it some loss, because there are some historical experiences from which something can be learned, it also clears the ground in a way for people to try to think in new ways. I thought one thing that was so fabulous about Occupy, to take the most recent example, was the total irrelevance of the past of leftism to the discussions, to the actions. No one was trying to form a new revolutionary party or argue about reformism versus revolutionary activity. So there is some gain, but I think what you put your finger on the most difficult problem, which is how to truly have a new thought. That's to say, a thought in which speaks directly to the material conditions people are faced with now.
I'm sorry, I just have to really disagree. I'm sorry.
Well, that's sorry. We're going to have to let the panelists
okay,
speak.
well, I'm just going to state my disagreement, and you can choose to respond to it or not.
It's wonderful how we can have conversations after the panel's durations. Let's save this for after. Greg, you have a question you want to
Professor
respond
Horowitz has to say in response to the question.
Okay, so sorry. I feel like the villain all of a sudden. I'm sorry. That was the point, right? It seems to me that in some ways the last three questions are connected to one another, and I'm trying to put my finger on what the link might be. The one way to understand the force of your question, I guess, would be this. the category of the new is, as you were suggesting, always in some kind of subterranean contact with its content, which is always not the old, but the archaic, right? What's lost its power to present itself in the current context. So, I mean, the point about, if we're going to do a Lazarus on anybody, we've got to do a Lazarus on everybody, otherwise we're unethical, right? There's a kind of claiming of the past that has no purchase on the present. And its representative in the present is the incompleteness of the present, which is figured in the form of the new, right? The as yet unseen. So the new is the vehicle for the pressing of unintelligible but legitimate claims, if that category is acceptable. Unintelligible but legitimate. Now, the problem with that is that if the way in which the unintelligible but legitimate claims have their force is by becoming intelligible, then what you have is a kind of, obvious reformist moment, right? Okay, let's readjust the categories of ethical recognition, and boom, we've got that problem resolved. So there's a way in which the avant-garde is always aiming, in this sense, at a recuperative possibility. And to go back to the first point, it seems to me Rancière is a radical anti-modernist. He hates modernism. Ask him that question sometime. Was there modernism? His answer is no, never existed. Right? But this seems to be internal to his project. The reason he thinks that is he doesn't actually believe that there are any unintelligible claims, and because of them, he doesn't believe that there's any problem of aesthetic autonomy. It's not that he doesn't think it exists. He's not even moved by the thought of it. Right? Instead, what he's got is the abstract conception of communism. Good for him. Right? Right? I mean, and I agree with Paul about this. The weird thing about the concept of communism is it dulls his thinking. Right? It's supposed to be an animating concept. It dulls his thinking. You cannot be sensitive to the demand for autonomy, which is the demand that the space in which the unintelligible legitimate claim is being pressed better not be closed off, better not become a social space too quickly, or else it will devastate the claims that are being made. Right? So I think these two are connected thoughts. But this actually then leaves a space open for the zombie. Right? The zombie is the one who says, "Oh, you think you understand me? I believe you." Right? It's a kind of vengeance on, you might call it, the digestive force of our best critical concepts. Right? And this seems to me an important symptom, I guess I would agree, both of the undying need for an unfilled space outside, but also the fact that it's almost, I think, almost beyond our imaginations right now. We don't have the politics we need to make that real. So we get zombies.
I'll take the last two questions. I'll just remind the audience and the panelists that the discussion on the new brought up a quote that Julieta wrote about the new always just prefigures the next commodity to come. So, the Hilo quote. So it's just something to think about. You had a question, and then the gentleman here, and then the gentleman back there, and then we will. Oh, did you have a question? All right, I will do four, and then that's my final, and then we'll close up everything. So, please.
Sure. I like to find a theme in argument or a particular sort of succinct slant, and I think the way that I'd like to frame this question is with reference to the end of art. And my question is, and then I'm going to sort of define my terms a little bit, but this is the question. Is there any resolution or revolution of class questions in art for the 21st century, defined as something in excess of material concerns, with the end of art as how it is to be consumed? And so just a couple of notes with that. Is the middle class bottoming out? Then art as distinction, class questions, as in who can consume art and how. And then in the 20th century and before, you have an explosion of different forms of art sort of completely reinventing categories of what made them, such as experimental music, pop art, the invention of the museum for the citizen, and then today something like GIFs, or how the internet is absolutely revolutionizing art. But so how can we think about? Is art to be consumed, or can it be more subtle than that in the 21st century?
All right, and then we'll take your question, and then we'll take the last two as the final.
Okay, so to continue, again with the zombie theme. There's this kind of weird language that you got. I think it was before Occupy, so this was like after the 2008 crisis, and the reaction to this crisis was largely, everybody could recognize from the right. It was the Tea Party and so on. You got this discourse of the strange non-death of neoliberalism. This kind of weird space where it seemed to be like completely discredited in material reality, but ideologically, it still had this sort of grip over the popular imagination. I wonder, with the death of art, there's an extent to which it's declared every few years. The same thing with punk is dead, whatever. It becomes a kind of truism that it loses any sort of force. It degenerates into a kind of mumbo jumbo. But I wonder if losing the ability to sort of emphatically declare the death of art as a kind of liberatory possibility itself, if I'm to have a sort of melancholy, it's a melancholy for the fact that we can't actually declare the death of art. We can't. It's not, the melancholy isn't, art is dead, I miss art. It's actually I miss the fact that we could declare the end of art and its fusion with life, to make the world artistic, to make the world a work of art. And so I wonder, if this sort of zombification, this sort of non-death of art, non-death of the left, this sort of continuation in this sort of decomposed form that generates all these kinds of possibilities. Greg, you mentioned it, I think you hit it on the head, with this idea of our politics being insufficient. It's something that Occupy was a kind of symptom of the fact that politics don't exist today. I wonder if that sort of has a sort of recursive effect on the aesthetic politics, the Rancière thing, these sort of borrowings of the past with no purchase on the present, these kinds of allusions to the kind of past moving, avant-garde ideas and representations that existed. It makes me wonder if if the aesthetic politics of referencing these various things lacks a politics, I wonder if it lacks an aesthetics too. What does aesthetic politics become whenever it's these representations of political possibility that existed palpably, really, in the past, but which are only kind of dimly alluded to or just gestured at. It's this kind of again, I guess my question is what would it mean to actually claim the death of art, or be able to, as a sort of task, to be actually upset at the fact that we can't declare a decisive end to the world as it is?
All right, let's respond to those two questions, and then we'll take the final two to conclude.
I really appreciate the way that you articulated it. There's something about, because the thing is, it's rationally we shouldn't be so naive to think that we can declare yet another end in the long history of ends, right? But there's something about, me feeling like you are in a new place where you can say, fuck all that bullshit. That you look at the end game of a lot of the art world, right? And you look at Thomas Hirschhorn or Jennifer Oler and Guillermo Calzadilla, who just to be real talk, I wrote the catalog for the thing for the Venice Biennial, and it's all about critiquing U.S. empire and blah blah blah. And it's I'm getting paid by the State Department to do it, And their work is amazing, formally, and it's beautiful, and I learned so much from it. But I'm also is this really what I signed up for as an art critic? You know what I'm saying? It's to write stuff for a State Department catalog. And similarly, look at the artists that are most in demand today have the greatest politics, like Sharon Hayes, Wally Broad, you know, and they do. I mean, they're a Cooper. They're doing amazing stuff. But it's also like there's a game that everybody plays in the art world about criticality, about left, about Marxism, about theory, and and it's been really productive and generative, and it's fed into something like Occupy. But Occupy was a threshold, and it made something new happen. And I think it's going to take the art world, even the very critical sectors of the art world, a long time to even fathom what happened, right? Because every other person in Occupy comes from the arts or is in dialogue with artists in some form or another. And I think there is, it sounds naive and it sounds embarrassing, there is something, though, about that thing of being like, you know, fuck this bullshit, call the bluff on the 1% relative to the art world, even the critical part, and be like, what does it mean to like practice art in this very much this expanded sense of like organizing assemblies and doing marches and you know organizing on the ground and like, projection, banners, like the whole thing. It doesn't matter if you call it art or not. That's why for me I like the post-contemporary thing. That although it's a problematic article, I like the Mason thing about post-contemporary. Recognize there's something new that's happened. There's a switch turn where a lot of people just like don't really give a shit anymore. You know. Which doesn't mean that you turn your back on all the beautiful things you can learn from art, all the beautiful experiences, the lessons, the resources, the platforms. But at a certain point, you do it because you need to do it, not because you want to have an intellectual debate about Adorno or Rancière. And I kind of feel like that's where a lot of people in Occupy are at. You know?
You know what it sounds a little bit like? It sounds kind of like, almost like I don't know, some kind of a early American story where you turn your head, you know, the face on the whole world, you leave Rancière, you leave Adorno, you leave everybody. Here we have the thing, it's real, it's the only real thing. Therefore, October, there's a whole issue about Occupy, which incidentally to me seems demonstrably dead, right? Because you only write about dead things.
Well, if I can put information, just so people know. So I actually got that, I got that thing going, the October issue of Occupy Wall Street. And if you guys want to hear the story of it, so the original idea was that instead of just having a bunch of people, scholars and stuff get in there, the original idea was you would invite like hundreds of people to submit to October, right? Then it would get overflowed, there's no way it could all go in the magazine. And so instead, all the responses go all online, and instead what's in the hard copy, just images. Everybody submits one image, right, of Occupy, or what's inspired them about Occupy. Then you have real beauty, right? Then you have an actual beautiful object. That would be the most artistic thing ever. That's where beauty and art comes back in, because you're like, you know.
But why are you doing
it? To bring in folks in the art world.
In other words, why do you want to turn it into a beautiful object?
Well, because the magazine doesn't really matter that much. That's the thing. It's about using that space to capture people's imaginations and to kind of open up the conversation, bring new voices to the conversation.
I'm going to let this conversation proceed later because I would like to get to the last two questions before we all zop out here. Did you have a response to the young lady or?
So is it time to respond or time for me to ask you a question?
Oh, well,
sorry,
I think
well, that's Paul.
Paul, Greg?
Yeah, I'm just going to say one thing. I'll try to keep this really brief. You know, there's a sentiment I've heard attributed to Benjamin, but I've never been able to track it down, so I've got to categorize it under something that sounds like something we would say, which is the issue of how to save Western culture is not on the table anymore. What's on the table now is whether it's worth destroying. Right? That is, whether there's any orientation we can derive from it that will allow us to see our way through it. Right? Give our politics a structure. Give our politics some normative force, something like that. Whether there's anything there. And there's something very odd about the state, I think, of aesthetic discourse right now, which is that everybody is scrambling to find a normative orientation. This is why it's an answer to the first question that was asked as well. Everybody's scrambling to find some normative orientation, but I think we've got to step back from it and at least entertain the possibility that we can and ask what that would mean for us right now. So as you say, there's no, I mean, you can declare art dead right now. Go ahead, do it. I give you permission. The problem is you get nothing from it. Right? That's the juice in declaring it over is dried up. Right? So this means it's no, but this the interesting book, I think, the argument I find totally unconvincing, but an interesting recent book, is that little David Josselett set of lectures. What was it called? After Art, I think, right? In which he does try to locate a sort of counter-authority in the mode of distribution of images, right? He calls for a redistribution, not of the sensible, but of the power of image making, right? And he thinks this is connected with new technologies. But this actually seems to me to be, even though I say I find the argument completely unconvincing, it's pointing in the direction where a new kind of answer might be found. So.
All right, the last two questions, and then with your responses, you could mix in your concluding remarks. For you, and then
oh,
yeah.
Okay. My question is with regards to. I guess I should frame it in terms of historicity, but I'm actually responding really even to sorry, Julieta. That's not her name. To start with, this idea of so how do we know that art is dead? What would we wear to its funeral? Well, I'd actually like to know what art is dead. And Greg mentioned that this is not something that we've been hearing for 200 years, in contrary to what a lot of people have said. It's really a more modernist statement than a romantic statement. In particular, I'm a bit troubled by an implicit canonization of classicism here, insofar as the art that we seem to be reacting to as dead, or may have been for 200 years, or at least 100, is far more, at least multifaceted, if not truly dialectical, than I think we're presenting it. I mean, we're pretty convinced, I think, that something approaching internet memes could be more or less considered via agitprop. This could be close to art within our day. So what's to say that, you know, political cartoons or forks or I don't know, boxes from the 1740s are not also art. In a certain sense, we seem to take that very implicitly, that is not art, but also very implicitly that such things, I mean, yes, this is via modernism, but somehow I find it very problematic the way in which we're discussing an end of art from such a unilaterally modernist perspective, and failing to go beyond that seems historically problematic.
And we'll take your question, and then you all have a chance to answer.
First, thank you very much for deeply philosophical discussion. If I extremely simplify the problem and translate it a little bit on everyday language, then we probably can say that what we define as art includes at least three things: artists, artworks, and art practice. Artists, some alive, some dead. Artworks we probably consider zombies because they feed on our emotions, but they all exist, but they are definitely dead. And then it's third thing, art practice. So what is we could say about art practice? Is it dead or is it alive? So is it relevant or is it not? And in this case, I personally could say that from my point of view, Occupy Wall Street is one of a few very successful, what we call public art project, which were seen by many people which were reacted by many people, which still practicing some kind of whatever, let's call it art. And for example, what usually public art project, it's like some boy or girl get $200 and get on the street with 20 friends and relatives and do something absolutely meaningless. And after that, put it in a resume, and that's it. Here we have a very meaningful and reaction on many, on our reality. And it's actually started not in United States, but only when it was opposed as a opposed Wall Street, then it became really successful and really known. So my question is about what we consider dead. Is art practice is relevant, and what we call art practice right now, what it is?
Panelists.
Well, maybe just a brief answer, just to go back to Julieta's text and her quote of Witte. The quote is extracted from a longer essay, which is actually about the death of the internet. What basically what Witte means by that is not that it's slow, or it's not that the emails don't arrive on time. What she means is like a kind of an end of or lessening or a depletion of emancipatory potential of a certain kind of paradigm. And the kind of utopianism, the kind of that we're there at a certain point at the rise of it, where suddenly all you see is spam and commercial advertisements and I don't know what, e-commerce or something like that. And or let's say the death of film for her is also kind of a moment where, films are produced as kind of marketing tools for a video game. And for her that kind of constitutes a certain kind of death. But then it continues. It doesn't mean that something just dropped dead and disappears. It has a life after death. As a kind of a zombie, because like it gets shattered and then it permeates our reality in this kind of strange, weird kind of entities. That it never quite goes away. So, this. I think I lost my train of thought.
So I wanted to thank a lot of those folks for putting these questions on the table. They really hit home for me. I consider myself kind of a recovering art critic, as it were, and so it touches a nerve in the sense that I do think that Occupy was a threshold for a lot of people, where it doesn't mean everything goes away, but there's something new emerging, and if people that's a good, exciting thing, and that it really does throw everything else into a new light, the whole kind of contemporary art system, from which we've learned so much, and that we do have debts there and relationships. So I like the concept of the post-contemporary. I think that's actually a pretty robust provocation, because there's been such a proliferation of discourse about the contemporary in October and beyond for the past probably 4 years. It's like a shit scramble of the contemporary, right? So somebody's saying actually all this energy around what's contemporary, what's the next step, just kind of fearlessly. We know you don't go through it. So I think there's something exciting about that. Here's the utopian part, though. I appreciate you asking me what would be the point of an October just with images, right? Because wouldn't that be aestheticized? What would be the point? The whole idea, right, would be that you wouldn't, and I'm not saying you, but in general, right, left intellectuals wouldn't be looking to a journal for their politics, right? That's the idea. You could have a journal that would be things that were beautiful, because you wouldn't be relying on the discoursive theory and art to do your politics story, because you'd already be doing it.
That just shows you're not fully recovered.
Okay. The point, so here's my last point, is that imagine this. Imagine suddenly people in Occupy all the time, they're like, man, that's beautiful. You see some shit, you're like, that was a beautiful action. That's a beautiful ash banner. That was a beautiful. And the idea that beauty comes back in this way, that's not Dave Hickey bullshit, right? It's not that, right? It's like militant beauty. It's like militant love. And it's a new thing. you know? And that, the fact that I feel comfortable saying in front of all these folks that I respect so much, peers and colleagues and everyone, like, I want to reclaim the notion of beauty. It's because I'm not scared that the aesthetic is going to fuck up the politics, because the politics are happening. You know what I'm saying? And that there's actually a new space for beauty and aesthetics in a new way that I think is exciting. So the idea of an October full of images, is like, yes, that's because everybody in the magazine was out on May Day, right? Or was out doing something else. They didn't have to, the magazine wasn't the thing. That's just like this place to have a collective memory of this experience that folks are having together that's going to feed into a whole future. So that would be the idea. So that's the kind of romantic dream of it, right? Is that you come back around to these concepts.
I think that let's say sometimes it's difficult for me to pronounce, but isn't aestheticization of politics fascism?
No, I mean that's the Benjaminian Canard, right? Or not Canard, that's the Benjaminian charge relative to fascism, which totally makes sense. Right? The Gesamtkunstwerk, the triumph of the will, etc.
But we're supposed to politicize the state.
And that's what's happening. Right? It doesn't matter what kind of theoretical model it corresponds to. It's the fact that like they're inseparable. And it's not a fascist Gesamtkunstwerk. It's the fact that like there are moments of experience and feeling and seeing and hearing and embodied sort of modes that are deeply embedded in a really radical project. So anyway, but I appreciate you bringing the thing because that would be the dialectical counterpart. That would be the danger, right? Is to fall into an aestheticization of politics in the old sense. But what if there's a new sense of aesthetics and politics that's not everything becoming fascist and awful, but actually it's like, oh my God, that's a beautiful demonstration. Is that fascist to say that? Like,
yeah.
Worship the Occupy, yeah.
Paul, would you like to?
Yes, I was actually very interested in the remarks of the gentleman in front of me, the artist painter, because it actually helped me finally at the very end of the discussion understand a little bit what it was about. Because I thought the point you made, that in a sense what people missed about the death of art was that utopian moment. That was the heart set of that, the idea of the merging of art and everyday life and the 1920s. And that indeed seems to be not with us as an aspect of the disappearance of the left of the earlier of the past century. And it seems to me that the counterpart to that, which has come up several times in many different ways, and also in your last comment, the treatment of Occupy as an aesthetic event, as a kind of art, as a piece of performance art. It's a very striking idea. It seems to me not an accurate one, in that the American version is much more devoted to branding and aestheticization, I think. But if you put Occupy into the international context of the Indignados, of the riots in Greece, you can see it seems to be part actually of a much larger social movement, which is in fact too large to be and too political to be contained by, and too social movement to be contained by these aesthetic categories. But the fact that it can be so quickly turned into an aestheticized object is really a sign of the present day weakness of the politics, and a sort of a call to try to deepen the political aspect of it. I think that's the lesson I take away from it.
Let's quick response to that, and then I'll
just interject one thing. I keep in this essay about the death of the internet and all sorts of other things. Basically, what she's saying is that actually art is very much alive, and in fact, it occupies life completely to the point where the political process becomes completely aestheticized. So it's not really in danger of dying at all. At the moment, it's it's in control.
Politics is in danger of dying. Where politics are in danger of dying.
That's for another.
So, can I make one last comment? Because I think that's it's. We're in a moment right now where the political weakness is being attested all over the place, but so too is the strength, therefore, of a kind of, I don't mean this in a really theoretical way, but a quasi-autonomous aestheticizing mechanism, right? So stuff gets turned into spectacle. It's not a deliberate tactic on anybody's part, because there's nothing there to be depoliticized. It just becomes spectacular so immediately. And in this respect, to make a direct response to this comment, I was on a panel with Tom Finkelpearl, who's the director of the Queen's Museum, who's working on all sorts of social practice art. And he asked a question in a form I never thought to ask it myself before, which was, okay, I love this stuff, I'm interested in this stuff, I think this stuff is important. Everybody wants to know, is it art? And he said, you know, I don't know. Why does everybody want to know if it's art? Why does that question matter? But it does matter, right? It's a kind of driving question. And it brought to mind to me a person I think that was one of the sort of the originators of social practice art, was Gordon Mattaclar. Right? Didn't have the concept for it at the time. But you know, now I hate going to galleries because I'm afraid that I'm going to be fed. Right? And it's not snacks that I'm being given, it's actually the art itself. I feel like I'm in some bizarre version of degenerate Catholicism or something. Right? Here's the stuff itself. Eat it. Right, but Matt Clark invented this kind of practice, except it seems to me there was not and I mean this literally, the pretense of its making its way into the art world. Right? And this had something to do with the way in which it was propped up politically, and something to do comparably with a kind of weakness of the concept. And the concept has oddly become so robust that it's almost hard to figure out how to think about, say, social practice without thinking about art. And I want to say, let's slow down.
Think of like mental practice, right?
Right, or exactly, or political practice. Right? I want to say, let's slow down on this for a moment and see what the urgency is.
All right, everyone, please give our panelists a moment. Thank you for everyone sticking it out. A group of us will go to some bar somewhere, so if anyone wants to join us.
I did not need to be awesome.